Hey guys, I'm Mike Curtin. This is the Brew Old Order podcast, and today I'm with Jason zumBrunnen. Sorry, of Ratio Beer Works in Denver, Colorado. How are you doing, brother? How's everything?
I'm doing great. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on. Can you just give me a little breakdown about you, where you grew up, how you kind of just got into the beer industry and wound up opening your own brewery?
Yeah, you got it. So just the quick version of it. Grew up in Colorado. Went to school at CU Boulder. Went into chemical engineering, which is actually somewhat typical of people going into brewing. Didn't think of it much at the time, but I was in school in the 90s there. So we actually had some craft beer in Boulder and didn't realize it wasn't everywhere. We had Boulder Beer, Walnut Brewery, some of these great, first craft brewers in the U.S.
Right.
So really loved it there, and then kind of went and didn't want to do engineering and went and did a lot of other stuff. I was playing in a punk rock band in college to do something outside of engineering, and
Right.
that actually took off, even though I got a job kind of in engineering out of school. Pretty quickly, we all quit our jobs and went and toured the world doing punk rock for a while.
Awesome.
And so while that was a phenomenal way to see the world, it also was kicked up my beer interest even more so.
Of course,
I'd
trying all
started
different
homebrewing
stuff.
back in college and all that too, making terrible beers.
Right.
But traveling the world, getting to go to Europe, Japan, all over, and then the U.S., seeing, oh wow, there's other beers, and there's places there aren't to these other beers too. And then settled in California, got into film industry a little bit in post-production and studios. And only thing I say that is I all of a sudden had a lot more time, and I had a better paying job than being in a band.
Nice.
So I started building out like legit homebrew and getting really involved with it, and starting to think of wanting to go into the beer industry. So somewhere at the ends of like 2008, 2009, was thinking of moving with my family back to Denver from California and getting into the brewing industry and hoping to own or start a brewery, and realizing it was already getting competitive. Little did I know it would get so competitive. But
Right.
part of that was I wanted to go back to brewing school. So I went to brewing school at Siebel in Chicago, and then I went over to Doman's Academy in Munich before moving to Denver, starting to brew bottom up. Got a base level job at Wincoop, one of the original kind of brew pubs in the country, and worked my way up and started working on business plans the whole time. Reconnected with some friends from college and Scott Kaplan, my other partner, who was in business. And we reconnected over love of beer and this idea of maybe starting a brewery. So took another 5-6 years, a while of raising money and getting the business plan, everything together. And 2015, we opened Valentine's Day 2015, we opened Ratio Beer Works right in the heart of Denver. And then as of this year, just opened our second location too.
Very
So that's
cool.
the quick version.
Gotcha. Perfect. And you talk about raising capital to open
Yes.
your business. How did you go about doing that? And any
So,
issues
yes.
you ran into along the way?
Well, of course, first, when you first start your budget, you think smaller and it keeps growing. So, especially when looking at build out, it's funny how much some of those rough rules of thumb actually work, where they go, well, it'll cost about the same amount. Whatever your equipment costs, it'll cost that much to put in. You're like, no way, no how.
Right.
And you struggle against it till you find out, oh yeah, these are all good rules of thumb. So frankly, usually those contractors have a pretty good idea even beforehand. So I would definitely trust those, because that's wasted time for sure.
Right.
But
Gotcha.
yeah, we raised it all privately. We didn't want to start with a lot of debt, so we wanted to raise angel investors as shares in the company. So we did that first, starting truly with family and friends, and then kind of friends of friends that came out. And actually, frankly, that's where a few of our bigger investors came, is that secondary sets of friends of, like, I had a brother-in-law that works in tech, and he shared with someone that helped found one of their companies, and he kind of invested in a lot of small companies and has actually become one of our advisors. So that was definitely most intimidating for me. That wasn't my background. It was my partner's a little bit. He was more in business, but frankly, I was surprised. Some of it I didn't mind. It's the thing I thought I would do the worst at. And I didn't mind it because at the end of the day, people ask a lot about raising money. At the end of the day, it's a lot about telling your story and having a good background in it, and
Okay.
basically knowing the details. Interestingly, they cared less about this idea of your 5 year tenure. Of course, people want to see that, but they're also realistic. They know you're launching a company, so the
Of
idea
course.
that they're going to get into detailed nuances of your 7 year plan, it didn't happen at all. Even with well experienced investors, they're looking for foundation, and if we knew what we're talking about, and if we had thought about a lot of the bases. And frankly, being already in the brewing industry for 5+ years, plus writing the business plan, it was really easy to just genuinely tell the story of what we wanted to do. So ended up having better success than I thought. That said, it still took longer than we had hoped.
Right. And you talk about writing a business plan for all those years. Was there a moment that kind of kickstarted that aha moment for you where it was just like, all right, we're making this happen?
I think when we actually put it out to start raising money, that's where it was like, oh, okay, this is serious. Because frankly, I mean, maybe in a good way, we worked on versions of that business plan for a long time.
Right.
And in a weird way, it becomes almost esoteric. It's this piece of thing you're working on. But of actually getting to that next step where we're like, we think this is dialed, we're going to share this with some people. I think that was the real moment where it was truly like, here's someone we know or a friend of a friend actually going, I'm trusting you with some money. Don't screw it up.
Right.
By the way,
Yeah.
I don't know if we can swear on this. I was going to say don't F it up, but
Yeah, that's fine. We can swear
yeah.
on here. It's quite all right. And from that moment when you came up with the idea to the moment you actually opened your doors in 2015, what do you think was the hardest part through that journey for you?
Well, it's a series of stages. And by the way, being back as a little bit of an engineer brain of liking to play the chess piece out and plan ahead a lot, some of the most difficult was then taking those actually achievable steps along the way. But frankly, it's been the thing that's kept us going because projects can get so big so fast. And this was bigger than anything either of us had done and with our family. So after a while, you can kind of lay it out so far, but then you go, okay, well, what's my next step? And I'm going to take that. I've looked as far as I can and, made the best choices. So it came in a series of actually committing to go to brew school. I think is what kicked it off. So in a good way, people ask all the time, is it valuable to go to brew school? Is it required?
Right.
In reality, kind of the joke I made when I started at Wincoop, and remember this is 2010, so it was still low brewing wages. It was like basically almost minimum wage to start brewing then. And I knew it was going to be low pay, and I got it, and it was like kind of assistant brewer helping out, and it was just like bottom of the barrel, basically minimum wage pay. And I was like, oh no, I didn't know it was going to be this little. And it kind of was like, I did just finish full brewing program. I don't know if this matters, Siebel, all this. Mm. And they go, okay, let's go back to management. And they gave me a $1 raise. So to my wife, I was like, well, we know what brewing school was worth. It was worth $1, which is like $2,000 a year. And brewing school probably costs like $20,000 all in, for living expenses and everything. So I was like, it's going to take 10 years to pay off brewing school at this rate.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, I suppose directly it gave me $1 an hour. But frankly, there's no way I would have been hired in the first place at that job. And also, it was the ultimate motivator. I kind of had a little bit of a golden handcuffs job before. That film job just paid quite well out in Los Angeles. But it wasn't a growth job, but it was one where it was tough to walk away from making fairly easy, good money.
Right.
And so there's nothing better than actually committing to flying across the country and then across the pond to go to brewing school. And at the time, we had a 3-year-old son who's now 15. That was a lot of motivation. My wife's like, well, you better go for it then, right? If we're going to do all this. And frankly, that was the stress, but I'll tell you, it was the ultimate motivator. Even working low-end job, I just called that my paid internship, and it kept that motivation. That's probably the biggest thing that drove me, was taking the step where I at least had to see it through. Because if I had kept the job that paid me on the side pretty well, I think it would have taken either never happened or at least another 5 years, because it would have been easy to be like, it's a late night again. I don't want to work on the business plan. Right.
For sure.
I'll do it next week. I got a lot of work still. So sometimes making that commitment, while scary, was the motivation
Yeah, it's good
that really helped
motivation
it
for
kick it
sure.
off.
Yeah, I know. When I first heard what Brewers made, I think I was kind of like blown away. I was like,
Yeah.
wait, what? Like
It's getting
that's
better
like
for sure.
that's the blood, sweat, and tears of your brewery and everything. That's pretty wild to me. But I
Well,
mean,
and especially back then,
yeah,
Wynkoop is a true brew pub. So, the the old GMs there at the time, and there's great people that found it, Hickenlooper and all this, but it really felt like still in their mind it was an extension of the kitchen.
right,
So we really brewers were paid like starting line cooks essentially at the time.
gotcha. Yeah,
Even though there was this extra training and it was the lifeblood, I'm not sure people were going to Wynkoop if there wasn't a brewery there. So it was funny of trying to recommit the value of beer to a company that helped drive that value to Colorado. But even still, internally, you had to convince them why beer was important and why they should support brewers and, increased pay once they show their value for sure.
right, yeah. Um, so you worked in, you said breweries before this, before opening your own place.
Yep.
When you finally opened your own place, what's something that you never thought you were gonna have to deal with that you had to deal with?
Well, number one for sure is even as much as the places I worked where you did a lot of work, at the end of the day, there usually was always someone above you that on a bigger picture issue come up, you could pass off.
Right,
And while inherently you knew that we are starting our own company, very real is you need some massive thing to go wrong, like boiler go down, or get a call in the middle of the night that water's flowing out your front door. Of truly being like looking around and going like, well, I guess I'm the last person. I guess I have to deal with this.
yeah, no
And
fingers to point to.
yeah, and going and I don't know how to deal with it. Maybe
Right,
right of we got a call, middle of the night of before we had opened. Somebody was walking by, found we didn't even have a phone number yet, but found our website because we had a sign in the window, and there was water flowing out our front door,
there you
which
go.
we were working on some plumbing and a pipe had busted and was just. That's also where we found out we're glad we had concrete floors in our tap room because it cleaned the crap out of them. It was awesome. We also found the good news is our floors sloped to our front door, so. But it was like,
Perfect.
well, I don't know. I'm going to go over and see what happens. And you start realizing, well, you're the only one that actually cares, and understandably so.
Right, for sure. I don't know if you feel like that was one of the biggest things that adjustments you felt you've had to make, or is there a bigger one than that?
That's probably the biggest one for sure. The amount of extra work, I was fine with that, and doing other projects, and even being in bands or things. That idea of like, well, you got to put in the effort, and in fact, you probably have to do it, even if you're working at night and weekends and all that. That felt pretty natural of like what you expect, but that element of like once you flip the lights on and open, where it's like you have to make the decision. Even things like, you know, you look to other trades. We were putting in our electric plugs and things at the time. So besides scoping out the brew house and all this, there's ones in the front, and we had contractors too. And I figured they're like, well, where do you want your plugs? And I was like, well, isn't that why we hired you guys? I was like, where would you put them? And all of a sudden, some of these they'd be like, oh, I'm not saying anything. You have to tell me. So all of a sudden, I was like, okay. I mean, they would do it to code, but I was like, wow, I have to now think about where do I want electricity, these lighting? Because sometimes when you open a brewery, you think, well, how many tanks? What do I want to brew? And generally, what do I want to do? Like, how do I want to lay out a tap room? But realizing even on these tiny details that you thought someone else would be like, well, here, I'll tell you what. A lot of times
Right.
people are like, nope, you have to tell me. And you're like, okay, I guess I'm going to learn something about electricity now.
Right. A lot on the mind. Yeah, and owning a business of any sort, including a brewery, there's a lot to deal with. How did you go about dealing with balancing family and work?
Yeah, it was hard. I would say it's not in balance. And in fact, that's probably a reality of someone really starting it out. That doesn't mean unhealthy unbalance, but in fact, if you're married or have other commitments, there is this element of an understanding before you go into it is it's going to be an imbalance.
Right.
So what you want to make sure is it a sustainable imbalance, or at least for sections of time, right? I think that's probably the key, because you go through waves of it. It's not like you keep your motivation up. You get overwhelmed and need to take breaks and just say, like, I'm gonna have to put this down for 2 or 3 days. It's getting overwhelming or breaking it into pieces. But yeah, we had a lot of good talks with friends, partners, my wife, about, well, what does this mean and what can you commit? But then on the reverse side, once you start getting it going, just as important, I almost had to actively start carving out more balanced time, because basically I don't ever have to go home, but then I also want to still have a regular life and be married and have my kid
Yeah,
talk
for
to
sure.
me.
Yeah, I ask the question all the time: how important is a mental break from everything? And you kind of just explained it right there and then. And I mean, I'm sure it
Yeah,
becomes
and the key one is,
becomes a lot.
you hear people, it's an easy answer to say, oh, you need to find work-life balance. But frankly, you have to realize sometimes it's going to be out of balance, and that's okay, as long as it's talked about and thoughtful in how you do it. But I don't know a way that you can be in balance inherently through the whole process. There's just no way.
Right. There's going to be the
So,
ups and downs of the
well,
whole
and
thing.
yeah, you're going to all of a sudden for a while be putting in 14 hours, and even when you're home thinking and talking about it. But every once in a while, my wife helps remind me that I don't need to talk about it all the time when I'm at home too.
Gotcha. Well,
It's gotten better
it's
too.
kind of it's kind of a passion,
Yep. Well, in 7 years in, it does get a little easier to find some of those balance points too.
Gotcha. And so I'm sure there's plenty things that have happened through since you've been open that you kind of look back and you're like, man, I wish we could have redone this. What's one thing you wish you could have redone from the get-go so that that problem or issue didn't occur?
I would say, since a little more on the business side of this too, of this discussion, we should have gone down to the studs on the place we took over. Back to budget, and of course budget was real. So I don't go
Right.
back and say, oh well, we should have started with 2 million instead of one. Like, those are easy things to say. It's like, okay, no, that's what we could do. So
Right.
we did well, but we did try to keep a few of the things, the people before us that had some bathrooms, and it was kind of a tap room before, but the bathrooms are at our original location are just been a nightmare, and we've at least paid over what it would have cost to just have rebuilt them from scratch to begin with. And so now it's like we'd have to shut down for 2 weeks or something to actually rebuild them. So we just
Right.
dump money into, like, polishing the turd, if you will.
Gotcha.
So yeah, frankly, we took over a spot that was an old brewery at our new location, and very much we took it to heart. We it's our second time through. So there was a few things we could have definitely kept, and there's a couple things in the front, but we actually purposefully took more time and said we're going to take out the things we know aren't good instead of trying to make everything kind of work from before. So
Right.
definitely, as much as your budget will allow, do it your way from the beginning instead of kind of taking maybe what's there or what the building is. I'd recommend that too when looking at buildings. I'm so glad we looked at enough buildings, and at the time, a lot of the marijuana grow houses were starting in Colorado. Let's call 2012 and beyond. So also we couldn't find buildings. So we are starting to be like looking at the craziest buildings. Like, well, we could probably fit this, or let's put the fermenters on the roof. Nothing that bad, but basically like that. And I'm so glad we weren't like trying to squeeze a brewery in where a brewery wouldn't fit.
Gotcha.
So it's worth waiting on finding your key items and go, well, those are non-negotiable.
I'm sure
So.
being a tap house prior to was a big decision in why you chose the location you chose.
Oh, for sure, especially on location.
Right.
If we had gone straight into production, we could have moved to, industrial, well, kind of was industrial when we moved in, but truly a little bit out of town and would have had no problem, much cheaper lease. And frankly, we could have had even better brewing space, but that is where a compromise. Colorado's really big on taproom breweries because our laws are pretty good about being able to sell straight to, retail over your own bar. So it's worth doing for sure, especially because it's so hard to get into wholesale brewing from starting from scratch. Really difficult. Just the profit margin's so low on wholesale.
So you were open for about 5 years before COVID hit you.
Yeah, it was 5 years almost on within the month because we had a awesome 5-year anniversary party. That's how I always remember. I was like, what was the last good thing that happened before COVID?
Yeah,
and it was
like pump the brakes.
Yeah.
How did you guys go about pivoting, making that work for you, and keeping your business going?
Yeah, and I know everyone's heard enough of a lot of these stories, but at least what's specific to us, we were taking our time to go into packaging, go into cans at all. It was what we wanted to do, and 2020 was our year to sign a lease to build out a production brewery. But amazingly, we had built our volume into draft only, into kegs. So when that hit, we had really good sales, and I mean, we were at like 300 restaurants and bars just in Denver. So we were trying to go deep and not wide, and we were draft only, and we felt great. Like, we'll take a year, we'll get into cans, and then there's a lot of volume there. But back to maybe the idea of being diversified as much as you can, that hit us hard because while everyone else usually does a little of both, and they could easily pivot into more of the package sales, we had nothing. Our sales went to zero overnight, especially when they first shut down the tap rooms. But everything else was bars and restaurants, and they all closed here. So we especially were in a predicament as a brewery where we were actually like, I don't even know what we'd do, go to zero. So within the first week of the shutdown, we had just been at a conference, and Wild Goose, which is one of the big craft beer canning companies in the country, is out of Colorado. And they had just modeled some new single head, small can filler at our convention like 3 weeks before. And we thought, that'd be fun for small projects or like barrel aged things. So we had looked into it a little. And luckily we had, because it was like 2 days after we actually had to shut down, we were calling them going, can we buy one of those canning lines? And they're called the Gosling. And it was, they went crazy. And we got basically a beta version they had built out for Siebel, the school. And in fact, at first they were like, we're sold out. And now we think it's going to be, we already had pre-committed and we hadn't built many. And now we think it's going to be 5 months till we have any. But we convinced them, because Siebel was shutting down with COVID, they were able to sell us the one they were going to debut for that school. So, and it was a beta version for sure. I think it was unit number 2. And it was, single hand feed the cans. But it helped. It got us into cans. Like you said, we were very disciplined and planned. We wanted a year of like market research on can labels and all that. And then we had a full-time graphic designer, and we were basically like, Anna, okay, remember that thing where we had a year to design one label? Now we need a label in 2 weeks, and then we need another label every week for another 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Because we basically released like 6 of our beers in a row. And we did it, though. And we did a decent amount of cans that year, and once sales could go, and got us into grocery stores. So in a weird way, too, any silver linings to COVID, we were maybe dragging our feet a little of how difficult and weird the world of going into packaging would be. And this just forced our hand into it. And now we're trying to stay in it. There's still a lot that we know is difficult, and it's new challenges, if anyone that runs a packaging line knows. But frankly, some of the others was like we were overthinking it. And so in some ways it was good we were forced into it, because then you don't have time to get nervous or think about it. You just are like, all right, I guess we're talking to Whole Foods this week, and don't even have time to get nervous about it because we're just trying to keep the company afloat.
Exactly.
So we had some good successes, like Whole Foods bringing us on. So
yeah, you got thrown right into the lions then, and how to make moves. Hey, man.
Yep. So yeah, we
sink
went.
or swim.
The one unfortunate thing too. I mean, there's different ways to handle it, but we cut down and did the the furloughs for a big part of our staff, especially front of house when we weren't running it. But we kept our main managers. So we went down to only about 5 people, and we were probably at 40 if you include bartenders. But we did keep our top people, and so it was like one brewer, our tap room manager, our head of sales, and everyone went back to doing a little of everything. It was almost like starting a business again.
Right.
I think it worked out, as hard as that was, and having to do big layoffs. I do think we were able to start pulling people back in sooner because of it. That we kind of went down to a core group. We had some other folks here that either waited longer and then maybe went just completely out of business. Or we saw some reverse where they were trying to keep less expensive employees and they laid off their managers. But then really, as you could imagine, struggled with anyone knowing how to run anything too. So
Yeah, right.
nobody had a roadmap, but that was our best guess, and we relied on
completely clueless. Just
on
gotta
friends
kind
or
of figure it out.
advisors, sometimes having cool heads, because I'll tell you, I'd pretend we were just all cool-headed through it, but we weren't, right?
Of
We
course.
were freaking out at home and going, what's going on, just like everyone else. And going, I don't know what to do. But just like I told you, when you start the company and people go, they all just look to you then. It was the
Right.
same way. This was like, well, what do we do? There's a pandemic. And you're like, in my head, I was like, I don't know what to do.
I've never,
But I
I've
was
never
like,
dealt
but
with a
I guess
pandemic
let's-
before.
Yeah, let's start with these things. Let's try these and let's go.
Right. Right. So I'm sure you've come across plenty of people in the industry, all who had to kind of deal with the same thing you did. But is there anybody that has basically left a big inspiration on you? Who's inspired you the most in the beer industry out of all the
yeah.
people that you've met?
That's a great question, and because we look at for different inspirations, and frankly, talking to other people, it's always good to look outside the industry as well, because it doesn't have to be from one source. So we had a few. What's great is from a culture perspective on how to build a company around brewing, it couldn't be better than New Belgium for us, right in our backyard where I grew up, and Kim Jordan in particular at the time. The idea of how that company built and the company culture and employees was just phenomenal. Just especially brewing was already a really nice social industry, but that company like no other. And of course it expanded and grew, and it's a different company and now it's sold. So I'm sure a lot of that's changed quite a bit, but couldn't be better than the idea of building a strong culture, the New Belgium. And then from brewing, from that idea that we were trying to stay close and not expand quickly, we always looked at New Glarus out of Wisconsin. They're just this amazing story of, one of the biggest breweries in the country, and they don't sell any beer outside of the state of Wisconsin.
Right.
I had a good mentor. I went to AC Golden. One of my jobs, I got a technical job inside of Coors before this to get technical brewing. And one of the mentors there that helped run AC Golden just really inspired in me the idea of, if you can grow in your own territory, that's the real growth. And he basically said, anyone can grow by opening a new territory, but it's hard to sustain that. So he's like, when you look, your real value is, can you grow within a territory? That's where you should look at the health of your company or not. So we've taken that to heart to say, can we know Denver and can we grow here before we start expanding and opening up like the next town over? So. And then I'd also say, just from brewing, Mitch Steele, who was at Stone Brewing, from a technical side, I listen if he ever gives advice or writes papers and things. Just seems like a sharp guy in the industry. John Mallett from Bell's is another guy that usually what he says. But yeah, New Glarus, Kim Jordan at New Belgium, all those have been pretty inspiring for sure.
Yeah, John Mallett was actually just mentioned recently. I just interviewed the owners of Burns, Wayne Burns and Laura, and yeah, they actually mentioned him, spoke very highly of him.
He's a great, if you ever get it, he's just inspiring anyways, and just so committed into the industry. So, and there's a lot of those people, they're there long enough they get over some of the hype things. There's always things to learn from those breweries too that are doing weird, wild, new, wacky things, because then new techniques come out of that. But
Right.
After someone's done it for a while and sustained success, and they're interesting to listen to.
Yeah, right. It's
By the
always a
way, if
good
you've
thing.
ever heard Randy Mosier, who has written some very famous books, I'm blanking on the. It's the one that if you're going to study for Cicerone, it's kind of the base book, but he's awesome to hear talk to. But that's more on the like tasting and experience and history of beer for sure.
Gotcha. Good to know.
Yep.
Good to know for sure. Is there a moment that sticks out for you, in your head that when possibly when you were first opening, I guess, that is kind of a moment of success, like things were going in the right direction?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that too. One other kind of weird phenomenon is you're so busy when you open. Even kind of our first, as you open and do kind of parties, it's hard to actually kind of celebrate. There's so much going on, right? It's like people say at their own wedding, it's hard to enjoy your own
Yeah,
wedding.
right.
So
Yeah, right.
usually at our anniversaries is my moment, especially to take a step back and if we get some bands or fly in, that where it kind of hits me of this is pretty cool and come together. One other interesting part that's a very small part of joy, and I know causes heartache for other people, but the social media side of it, like Instagram for me, was surprising of knowing obviously we're doing it, but I do find a lot of joy in because we're a taproom brewery, is when we look through and we get tagged and people are there. One wonderful thing about beer is it's such an enjoyment of people coming together, especially in like digital world of people getting together in real life and using beer as this connector, which is one of our goals when we started it. But we are both musicians, and this idea that beer connects you when you go to these events or shows, and so I love it. So seeing people's posts of them just having a great time at our brewery, it's really minor. It's not huge moments, but that's where you go, wow, this is really cool. And then
Right.
also a bunch when people have their first dates and then get married and they tell us they had their first date at the brewery. I
That's
like
pretty
that too.
awesome.
That's pretty cool.
It's really awesome. Kind of being a part of people's storyline.
Yeah.
It's definitely cool. I know for sure. I just posted something the other day because I went into the brewery very close to my house, Finback. I don't know if you're familiar with
Oh
it. It's
yeah.
in
Yeah.
Queens. They have a beer called Ultimate Beats, one of my favorite, and they just put it back out. They do it with Jay Wakefield, collaboration with Jay
Yeah.
Wakefield down in Miami,
Florida. Yeah.
and yeah, that's one of my favorites. And every time it comes out, I'm like posting it online, letting everybody know because everybody knows that's my favorite beer. I always talk about it. So yeah,
I love
um,
it. Yeah. I actually enjoy some of the smaller moments even better. So we've just recently had some good success in GABF and World Beer Cup now, like 3 years in a row, and we just won. And while I love
awesome.
it, frankly, those don't bring me the same kind of big joy. I like it in the sense of it's good affirmation and it's really important for our sales and our brew team because they're the ones
Right,
that ultimately did it. But it is funny of that's not where I usually look to find, that's a nice. I feel happy for our team with those. But
right.
for me, it's more the day to day of people enjoying your beer is really exciting to me.
Very cool. Uh, is I know a lot of people talk about the brewing industry as a almost like a brotherhood. You can talk to the guy down the street. Any advice you got for me because they've been in the game longer or whatnot. But is there a way that you try to stay ahead of your competition?
That's a good question. In Colorado, I mean, it's almost everywhere, but Colorado is amazingly collaborative. And actually,
Right.
a little bit of shout out to the one big bad brewer that ever, but Coors, frankly, is different. And when it was at least family owned before all the things, they're
Right.
amazingly good to the craft brewers around here. The sharing of knowledge, people within it. Not necessarily at the top. I get it's competitive out when you're looking for tap handles, but from the brewing side, I think that's one of the reasons, frankly, the Colorado beer culture was as good as it was in craft. It started there. If you look at when Charlie Papazian started, he wrote Joy Home Brewing and started the Brewers Association. All those things were in the late 70s. The old pictures were there's people from Coors and Boulder Beer and like Charlie and like that's all it was. I mean, it's
Right.
truly the ultimate starting of well, here's 8 people that are into this. And then
Right.
it's cool and it grew from there. But yeah, it is. But it is correct. As much as it's fun and on the brewing side, especially as it gets more competitive, at the end of the day, usually the sales folks will tell you, hey, while we love these other breweries, at the end of the day, you are competing, especially outside, right? If
Right.
a place has 12 tap handles, there's only 12 people that get on, and we've got 300
Right.
breweries in Colorado, or 400 now.
It's tough.
So, you know, you have to admit we're competing too. So, I would say the nice thing too is we come from that DIY of when we used to be playing punk rock shows and my partner of booking your own shows and all that. The spirit of our brewery, we really have been kind of DIY. Whenever we partner or ask favors or vice versa, working with other groups, we do always come to that. At the end of the day, we want to make sure we're not too reliant on anyone else. We don't. If we're asking more than a single help or favor, it's one thing to ask for hops that you're out of. But if we realize, boy, this is like the third time we've reached out to these folks, that's a good indicator of we need to learn this ourselves or bring it in house. We're
Right.
completely self-distributed too still, which you can in Colorado to a certain size. And part of that is the model, but it's also of we realize when we're competitive and we're small, one other touch point is if it's our drivers delivering beer and it's our people cleaning your beer lines, that's one more touch point. We're small. Nobody knows. Well, like when we open, nobody knows about us, right? And why should they care? So every moment we can be part of who we are, starts building that name, and then partnering, with like-minded businesses. When we opened, we only picked like 10 restaurants that we wanted to focus on, and it was specifically ones that we thought, well, this will help people associate our brand as well of where we should be, and that's really helped. So you definitely have to stand enough on your own. The camaraderie can be there over beers and or sharing ideas or helping with hops. But when it's running your own brand or what you're doing as a company, the DIY mentality is really good of letting you, that's how you can kind of stand out from the group too.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So you've been in the industry for a while now, but in the last 5 years, what would you say is the biggest change in the industry?
It was COVID, jeez. Oh my God.
Well,
I mean,
besides COVID,
okay. Oh, so
bit,
besides the most massive thing to happen, yeah.
yes,
So what's
yeah,
second place? Way second place for us, or the industry?
for the industry.
Well, I'll speak only. I mean, I'll talk about Colorado for sure. A gradual change that happened out here, which I think is overall happening, but for a little while when I was moving back, Colorado, I was in LA when Oscar Blues released Dale's Pale Ale, and it came in a can, and everyone lost their minds. It was really cool. It kind of put Colorado on the map again, and the idea that craft beer was in a can. So if you go back to that like late 2000s, that's the massive shift, right? Craft beer went into cans. And then craft canning came about with like Wild Goose with Upslope here of really on a smaller scale, but you're not on a $1 million system, but you're also not on a hand-fed original cask that was made for soda, which is what it started on. So that was probably the biggest early driver I saw, starting to be like good beer in cans. And
Right.
then, but then in Colorado, there's been a big shift of everything was big for a while. That was like Colorado's thing. So I brought up Dale's Pale Ale because by any standard, that's an IPA, right? It's like
Right.
6.5% or something. It's like 50 BUs. I mean, you're like, that's an IPA every day down the middle. And yet they called it a pale ale, which was intentional, hearing about the kind of origin stories of it. But that was pretty common in Colorado. It was a little like, let's do every style but bolder, bigger and bolder, more alcoholic, big. So,
Right.
you look, besides maybe New Belgium was a little more traditional, but your Avery's, Great Divides, all those Oscar Blues were just making massive beers. Everything was big. So for
Right.
us, by the time we started, the shift back to like regular strength session beers. And especially in Colorado, and maybe it's because we have such, not only was Coors here, we have a Budweiser plant, but the shift back to the idea that, a clean lager or, simple beers are worthy of doing as a craft brewing company and that they sell has been a big shift. The good news is I don't think that's a shift that'll ever go away. Frankly, you know, flagship style beers have sold well for 500 years around the world, so that's not going away. Maybe black IPAs go in and out of fashion, but a good drinking beer it might go in some waves, but it should be accepted everywhere. And so now, man, the good lagers and simple beers in Colorado is awesome.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I was always, big into the, imperial IPAs,
Yep.
double IPAs, all that heavy, imperial stouts and everything like that. And then I went out to San Diego, and I spoke to Clayton at Epic in San Diego, and I think it was San Diego if I'm not mistaken, but maybe I'm wrong. But wherever they are, and he let me try like a Japanese style pilsner, and it like blew me away. I'm like, oh man, maybe I need to start trying some more pilsners and lagers, and go away from the heavy beers for a while, and
Oh
start
yeah.
opening up
Well,
my palate.
the nice thing is it's good to have balance. Where I
Right,
mean, I love those as well. And when I was in LA, I was in Southern LA, so Stone was like an hour away for us, and they were making the bitter wars were on in craft beer, especially the
right,
West Coast. It was like we're gonna make big, dry, bitter IPAs. So it was either Stone was making either bitter IPAs or strong bitter IPAs. That was like what Stone was known for. But it was great at the time. But it is nice to have
right,
some balance and be able to switch between them too. I
for
was in
sure.
Portland a couple years ago, and they were so big on IPAs before the haze craze. But it was funny it was like all IPAs. That's like all they had. Maybe pale ales and IPAs. You'd go to a brewery and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, we have 10 beers on tap. Awesome." And 9
All
of them
IPAs.
are some kind of regular IPA. And you're
Yeah,
like, not even a stout, something else.
duh.
Yep.
Yeah, me and my friend talk about that all the time. Where there's a couple of breweries we've been to, and it's like, don't get me wrong, I love IPAs, but it's like I want to go to a brewery and like see a little variety. That's
Yeah.
why you go to a brewery, and then yeah, if you have like 10 taps and like 6 of them IPAs, like come on, man.
I
But
know.
speaking of different types of beer, what was your gateway beer into the craft beer world? What was that one that kind of opened your mind to,
I
oh
had
wow,
two.
beer could
Yeah,
taste like this?
I had two. One was in college, and it was called Buffalo Gold, and it was made by Walnut
Buffalo.
Brewery. And it was like a golden ale. So it was just a little maltier and tasty. They still kind of make a version, and then Boulder Beer kind of took it over. I don't even know who actually still owns the brand anymore, but
Right,
it's kind of dead. But I remember that was definitely the jump from Keystone Light, which was big in CU Boulder at the time because it was
right,
cheap, and to actually go, hey, we're going to spend a little bit more, and here's really good. The second one for me was IPAs, and I'd kind of had a few tastes or whatever, but I realized I hadn't really had one legitimately, or at least the full one, till I was out in LA, and I was at Father's office in Santa Monica, and I ordered a Racer 5 by Bear Republic up
Racer
north
5, yeah,
California.
Bear Republic for
I
sure.
remember the bartender, this is funny now, like you would ever do this, but he warned me, you do know this is a bitter beer, right? Because it was an IPA. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, of course, no problem. And I remember I took that first sip and it was like, oh my God, it was so
Oh, this is
bitter
really
compared to,
bitter.
I mean, and now I bet that was barely bitter at all, right? But the first sip, I was like, oh my God, what did I do? This beer's, I'm not going to be able to drink it. And this bartender's going to laugh. But, 2 sips in, your, palate acclimatizes.
Adjusts,
And then I was
yeah.
like, man, this beer's delicious. My first sip was like, oh my God, what I do? And then I was like, wow, this is delicious. I really liked it. And that's probably the big swing where I was like, whoa, this is wild. Because maybe Sam Adams was maybe the, the stronger beer I'd had before that,
Right.
like legitimately a few times. I'm sure I've had some, but that was the first truly sat down and ordered this IPA, a West Coast
Yeah.
IPA in particular.
Well, I'll tell you what you did. You opened up a whole can of worms because look at you now.
Yeah, I know, totally.
So, speaking of your brewery, what's next for your brewery? What does the future look like for Ratio?
So yeah, massive changes, of pivoting through COVID, and we were going to be open a production facility. And in fact, it wasn't our goal to necessarily open another tap room. We'd gotten a lot of offers to do it, but we're pretty much an urban brewery that likes to connect either art or music and things in a city. Um, so we were getting a lot of offers and things from suburbs, but we haven't built our brand strong enough. We didn't want to just, franchise or something. So we were looking for that, but with COVID, everything changed. And then certain opportunities started coming up. Frankly, we started getting more calls back. We had been looking at buildings for 2 years before COVID,
Right.
and prices were going up through the roof, and everyone's like, well, we'll call you back. And then all of a sudden we were actually getting calls back, and that was
Right.
wild. And we are like, no, we're trying to just not die over here, figuratively and literally too. But
Yeah.
but as we started coming out, we're like, okay, now we're canning, and this is terrible because we're doing it in our original brewery that is not designed to also have a little canning line in there. So we were jammed on top of each other. And so it was like, well, what can we do? Can we contract can a little bit? So we even had started doing some contract canning of a brand just to take some volume off. But back to our DIY, we want to bring that back long term. So, and then an opportunity came of a brewery that had gone out before COVID. And then for like the 2 years of COVID, they had gone through a bankruptcy, and the building owners slowly bought all the equipment out of that. So basically we heard again that that was available again as a spot, and we knew they had built out an area for canning at least. And so that worked, and we ended up having to buy a new canning line from Cody, but some of the infrastructure, other parts were there already. So frankly, we think this is a good hybrid. It's a full second tap room. It's still in an urban part of the city in a new up and coming neighborhood called Overland. So we think this buys us a couple years on the canning side to get our feet, actually learn now. Before we were just scrambling for 2 years, learning on the fly. Now we're trying to be disciplined again, bring in people that maybe have some more expertise in this world. And then hopefully the tap room builds where that brewery can exist on its own just for brewing beer for the tap room and for accounts near there, but not trying to run it as a production facility. So the interesting one is if we see continued success in it, I think we'll go back to our plan of some kind of production facility that we look at, where we actually build it out with the correct space to pull in cans and all that, and be able to package more and brew a little more efficiently there. So, but that means, and then I'll see us expanding in the next 5 years to other cities, because we're still predominantly in Denver and a little into Boulder, but we'll probably get up into Summit County, the mountains here, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs. And our long-term goal is, I don't think now, especially, COVID reset some priorities, but we're not going to expand outside of Colorado. It's really not in the cards. So we're going to go as
Right.
strong nuclearis as we can of just continue to grow within the state. But we had good growth. We lost hard. We were down 40% in 2020, or 60% maybe. We were down to 40%.
60%. Jeez.
But we gained it all back by 2021. So
Right.
by fighting hard and
People
all our
came.
teammates,
People came out in droves.
yeah, and
Yeah.
we got 20% of it because we were able to go into cans back.
Right.
So we set a record last year now. So what's funny, the BA put their guidebook out of breweries and their sizes, and our size shows like a 77% growth because it was last year's numbers.
Right.
And it was like,
Awesome.
well, yeah, first we honestly submitted our numbers. I looked at some of those, I was like, no way nobody was down that far. It felt like we were the only ones that put a really low number for 2020.
I'm
but
sure
I don't know. I
everybody
don't know
kept
what they're doing.
their mouth shut.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to brag about being down that low. I'm
No,
sure.
I know. But of any time where it's like everyone gets it. But so, yeah, we hope it's a struggle, and it's almost like starting a new business post-COVID for sure. It's just a
Right.
different world again. So the good news is sometimes it refocuses back to the important parts. And remember, at its base, like if we lose a batch of beer or something, we just had a brewer put in the lemon. We did a full puree, and he put it into the wrong beer, which
Oh, no.
one of funny stories of things that always happen. But at the end of the day, you go, is a really, really great brewer, and it was a mistake. And you're like, that it's just beer, right? We're
Right.
not doing, you're not doing heart surgery over here.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
frankly, the pandemic put it into perspective of like, boy, there's much bigger problems than we have one bad batch of beer that we got to deal
That's
with.
great. Hey,
Yeah,
that's a great way to look at it. For sure.
yeah.
For sure.
I don't want to go through
Um,
that lesson again, though. I don't think anyone does.
no, I'm sure. I'm sure you don't. I'm sure you don't. And if somebody came to you and asked you for advice on opening their own brewery, what advice would you give them?
Man, I suppose that's, I'd have to rethink it now post COVID for sure.
Right.
At the end of the day, especially depending on where they're at, but if you should start with the tap. I mean, unless you have, $10 million, how do you make $1 million start with 10 million? But
Right.
if unless you have a lot to start big, I wouldn't do it. The taproom model's the right way to do it. If you can't, if your state allows it. And then
Right.
at that point, it's that location does matter. There was a little period here in Colorado and Denver. Location almost didn't seem to matter. It was just so much fun every time a new brewery had opened. And people thought, even when we opened 2014, oh, Colorado and Denver, they're already saturated and overdone. But in reality, Denver didn't have that many breweries. When I moved in 2010, there were only 9 breweries in Denver, in the city proper. There was more in Boulder and Fort Collins. And by the time we opened in 2015, Denver crossed 60 breweries. So in the 5 years, like 50 breweries
Yeah.
opened.
It was hard when I just came when I just went there. It was hard to hit
Oh,
everything.
we used to be able to hit
I
every
wanted to
brewery.
come there, and I just it was just so much, so
Yeah.
much.
Well, we're in the River North Art District, and we now have more than 10 breweries in our neighborhood. I think we might be the densest neighborhood in the country if you with
Yeah.
breweries, distilleries, and cideries.
Right.
Just in our neighborhood, we have more than 10 in our neighborhood. We've got 2 distilleries, 2 wineries, a cidery still. So it's wild. But so in other
Yeah.
words, it'd be easy to say, well, don't open a brewery, but you might not want to open in our neighborhood right now.
Yeah, no,
But then again,
that might not be the best
when
idea.
when we opened, I think we were the third or the fourth, and we actually thought, oh, there's too many, you know,
Right.
they're down the block or so, and now we have 5 within like block of each other,
Right.
and those are okay. We're all doing well, and it helped for a while. So, but still, location really matters now. People, unless you really bring the hype, you better at least have a decent spot that people can get to. And that doesn't mean it has to be walkable and in some already built up neighborhood, but it better be where then a destination spot and the place is cool and people can hang out.
Of course.
So
Around other
that's key,
popular
because
spots.
you being able to sell your own beer over your tap is what funds any expansion that you want to do. And if you can get your fundamentals at your own spot, you can then expand outside. So I would say that it's like start as tight as you can in, get your fundamentals down, and then expand. So instead of trying to take over the city or the world, you might need to add a couple years in your plan then for it, and not just say you're going to be explosive growth. But I mean, you've seen it. The one I'd say is, that I bucked the trend for a minute was Modern Times. You're like, oh, they didn't. They're just going for it, and they were doing it. And if they got derailed for a couple other reasons, but boy, they also were so leveraged out there because that's just expanding big time. So it's hard.
Right.
It's tough to pull that off. It's a lot easier to make your mistakes when you're small, and you can make bigger mistakes because they're easier to come back from. And then you grow
Right.
a little bit. You still make mistakes, but now you're a little more seasoned, and then it's easier to fix those as you get bigger.
Right. Good lessons learned, for sure.
Yeah.
So, did you happen to have a funny story for us?
Oh yeah, I was thinking about what's all the funny. I was thinking about ruining beers, and also realizing too of, a good mentor of mine that I brewed under, of that idea of it's only beer. And what's funny is he could get pretty, not a short fuse, but he was a pretty serious guy on brewing. But if something really got messed up, he'd take a really great approach of, at the end of the day, it's beer, right? Like we're not,
Right.
as long as safety of people are there. So the amount of screwed up beers that other people have done. My only one that I screwed, well, the favorite one at Ratio was training our now sales manager I suppose it was on me, and everyone's probably had a hop fountain happen to them. But if you have a beer that's been fermenting and maybe you capped it off and it carbonated a little and you haven't dry hopped yet, it's like the Mentos experiment.
Yes.
And so I happen to be, there's not much you can do too once it starts coming up and exploding. And I have amazing footage that maybe I could share of maybe one of the best ones I've seen of it just shooting out top, hitting the ceiling of our brew house and just covering our entire floor before. And we had a couple breweries there in the front drinking. Somebody has a picture of it from our tap room, and you can see the fountains zooming over the top. But I'll tell you, without naming names, everyone's made those big mistakes. There's a pretty high up person at Coors that's got the nickname 2 Mash because they mashed in, put in their brew, and before they had pressed out to their mash press like a louder ton, they mashed in again their second brew on top of the first one and overflowed it.
Oh, no. Oh,
so everyone's even all the high up great brewers, they'll screw up a beer real bad. Something that seems real obvious. They mashed in on top of a beer that was already in there. But
I don't know. With my home brewing experience, I think the only real big mistake I've made so far was just not getting the gravity. So that's not that horrible. But if people ask me like, "What's the ABV on this?" I'm like,
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Have 2 of them and then feel it out. Let me know. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, no, I have a little segment called Quick Fire 5. 5 quick questions, all beer related. Ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. Somebody comes into your tap room. What's one of the beers you recommend they try?
I always started with our Dear You, our French Saison. It's a really dry sessionable one. It's one we won a GABF recently for, and World Beer Cup. And it's a good transition beer, especially if someone says, I don't like beer, but maybe they like wine. That's the one I usually shoot them to.
Okay. Favorite brewery other than your own?
That's a great question. For local right now, back to the sessionable, one open on the edge of our neighborhood called Cohesion. And it's a Czech-style brewery. And it was the guy who spun off of Odd 13, one of the big kind of hazy breweries that was in the town, well-respected brewery. And I thought he was crazy doing a Czech-only brewery. I was like, that's a niche. That's going to be tough. But, man, it's delicious. So they have a beer, their Czech 12 or something I think it's called, is just phenomenal.
Good to know. Well,
if you're going to ask me my macro one, it's a Coors Banquet, though.
Coors Banquet. I love Banquet, man. That's one of my favorites. Yeah. Believe it or not. I like this question. Favorite name you've come up with for one of your beers?
Yeah. We have a carrot elderflower saison called King of Carrot Flowers, and loved that. Came up with that name. That was inspired by, there's a song with that title, although it's not directly, it was inspired by it, but it's the first beer I had a name for before having the recipe done. And we did it for an indoor farm here in one of our food desert neighborhoods, and it was for their Harvest Week, a big festival. So we always tried to do some kind of fruit or a root vegetable beer, and so it was supposed to be a one-off. And so we used carrots, and then we used elderflowers. Going to use rose, but it's too perfumey. And it's turned into kind of a cult favorite. It was supposed to be a 1-week beer, and now it's turned into, it's probably our biggest specialty beer we do.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Barrel-aged, imperial, or both?
Oh, what do I prefer?
Yeah, barrel-aged, imperial, or both?
I prefer both. So
okay.
We've switched.
Me too.
Our main one, we'll do a barrel-aged imperial stout every year, and I love that style. It's great.
Me too.
It's a good way to drink a stout.
Me too. It's one of my favorites.
Yep.
And you have one keg of beer to hold you over for a 2-week quarantine. What beer are you choosing? Could be anybody's.
Oh, anybody's
Desert Island beer.
Desert Island. That's always a tough question, but I think I would go. What's funny is you would think, oh, I'll pick some specialty, some West Veteran
Right.
12 or something. But I'd probably go with like a Pilsner or something that those I just don't get sick of. That's kind of my everyday beer. So if I could have it every day, I won't get sick of it. So maybe that Cohesion Czech 12 Pilsner.
All right. Well, Jay, that's all I got for you, man.
Awesome.
That's
That's great.
everything. Thank you very much for being on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. I'm Mike Curtin for the Brew World Daughter podcast. Here with Jason. I'm gonna do this right. I'm gonna do this right this time. zumBrunnen,
All right, we'll
correct?
take it.
Okay. Damn it. Okay. Of Ratio Beer Works in Denver, Colorado. Thank you very much, man. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.